We will now move on to our panel discussion, Exploring Intersectional Experiences. I'm so pleased to introduce three outstanding panelists who will help to bring our discussion to an Ontario context. Dr. Jillian Perrick is an assistant professor and Canadian Research Chair in Disability Studies and Education within the Faculty of Education at York University. Jillian is also cross-appointed with York's graduate program in Critical Disability Studies as a previous teacher in special education and research coordinator with the Toronto District School Board. Jillian has conducted extensive system school-based research in Toronto, the areas of structural equity, special education, and academic streaming. In particular, her work explores how schools construct and respond to disability, as well as how students are organized across programs and systems. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Anne Lopez, who joins us from the University of Toronto in the Department of Leadership, Higher Education, and Adult Education. Dr. Lopez's teaching and research focus on anti-racist decolonizing, culturally responsive and socially just leadership in education and schooling. Her research methodologies include narrative inquiry, collaborative action, research, case studies, and biographical research. Dr. Lopez is interested in examining school leadership across contexts, and especially the Global South. And finally, I welcome Laura Arndt, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Survivor Secretariat for Six Nations. She was recently appointed as a lay member of the Law Society Tribunal. She's a BAM member at Six Nations and currently on leave from the positions of chair in the School of Advancement at Centennial College to assume COO role. She has worked in human rights, child rights, and social policy. Her work has taken her to the United Nations, Senate committee hearings, and before inquest proceedings. Notably, she's been involved with reports tied to the review of First Nations jury representation, coroner reviews into the deaths of Pikajikon, including inspired seminal report, The Experiences of Indigenous Post-Secondary Students in the Post-Truth and Reconciliation Landscape. Thank you to each of you for being here, and we are going to be bringing our Ontario context and looking at the critical perspectives and intersections here we're focusing on today. I just want to invite my co-moderator, Patricia Codner, who's currently the Family and Caregiver Engagement Literacy Lead at School Mental Health Ontario, on secondment from the Halton Catholic District School Board, where she is a Chief Social Worker. So let's start with our first question. And I'll ask if each of you can answer this. Can each of you share with us a current context in Ontario in relation to decolonizing education? Laura, could you go first?
So, yes, and before I start, I just want to take a quick moment to thank the opening this morning and offer my own acknowledgement. I join you from Oshawa, Ontario today, not from Six Nations, in the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, and the lands that have been shared by many nations over time, both the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas. And I want to acknowledge my people and yours, the grandmothers, the grandfathers, aunties and uncles, and the keepers and carriers of knowledge. We are not owners of knowledge. We are gifted and share that what is given and gifted to us. Make no mistake that the truth of our knowledge comes from our stories, our lived experiences, and our truths as Indigenous people. We are here despite education, yours, not ours. Our nations are distinct, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. As such, our contributions are born of distinct, self-determining people. And I think it's important to start in that space today, because a current example is, I don't work in the primary, intermediate, or secondary system. I work in the post-secondary space. And the current experience I'm going to share is the work that I've been doing with eCampus Ontario to develop 3 new courses for the eCampus delivery model. And I think it's important to just quickly talk about it as an example, because it's an example in conflict. There is a very set way around how we work in education and how we develop safe spaces for students. And we often think about creating safe spaces for students by ensuring that we're conscious of what information could be triggering, that we're conscious of what each student brings to the learning space, that we're conscious of what the student may be able to contribute, or what barriers they may face as a result of being in a classroom that is very Eurocentric and very Western, in a framework that assumes that we learn the same way, and that we all come from a Eurocentric base. So as I've been developing 3 new courses, I've been doing so as a result of the work that's been ongoing around Indigenous studies programs. And what I have found is a lot of the Indigenous studies program and courses that are being offered are really triggering. And the interesting thing is they're not particularly triggering for students alone. It's also for the faculty. These are new spaces for Indigenous people and racialized people. And when I talk about racialized, I'm not talking about people of color. I'm not talking about people of socioeconomic base, and I'm not talking of people of ability. I'm talking about racialized spaces where all of those things put you on the margins. So you could be all of those things. They could all intersect. And when you sit in the classroom, this is not your conversation. So I talked to you about an experience that we've been developing 3 new courses. And we did so in part because I saw the courses that were currently being offered were extremely triggering for faculty and for students. And I think part of the dilemma is that education is supposed to be neutral, or people assume that it's neutral, and it's not. And the way it's portrayed and it presents to people can create conditions of safety and engagement, or it can isolate. And as we started developing the 3 new courses, what we really strongly wanted to anchor was Indigenous knowledges were central, and knowledge keepers were that pillars that anchored everything we do. And so what we did is we brought a combination of students and knowledge carriers together in the work that we were doing. And it has been time consuming. The unfortunate thing was when it comes to education, time is never on your side. Everybody wants everything done yesterday, and you'll figure it out as you go. And I think the reality is, as our opening speaker had said, is time needs to slow down, and we need to do things in ways that honor and respect our ways of creating what I would call culturally responsive, culturally respectful, culturally responsible, and culturally accountable learning spaces. And as we've been doing this work, it's been a wonderful experience because we've had Indigenous knowledge carriers, and they're not MAs, they're not BAs, they're not PhDs. These are traditional knowledge carriers in the community who really do understand the nature of Indigenous education, Métis specific, First Nation specific, and Inuit specific. And I would say to you, as we've been doing the work, even I've had my eyes opened, and there has to be a humility around education and learning. And my eye opening has been the hardest part, and I'll be finished quickly. In working to create Métis specific content and course work. It's interesting because I have learned from students and faculty alike that they're really exhausted with being looped in and piled in with what is classed as Indigenous studies content, and they don't see themselves in it. Number 2, there is no one Métis community. I have been working with 4 Indigenous organizations who are part of the Métis nations of this country to try and figure out how to develop a course that is reflective of what I call from canoe to cart, from Ontario across the west of this country to talk about Métis history. And the interesting thing is, it is such hard work. And I would say working with students, working with faculty, it's been interesting because we're navigating firsthand the experiences of the barriers of colonialism and how it has made the conversations of cultural identity and belonging a political space. Two, we have navigated into the space of identity politic, which is also a reality and outcome of racism, in the fact that we often see organizations, there's the expression crabs in the bucket, there's the expression of lateral violence, where they tear each other down as they do the work because they're competing for the same ear. We're not talking about resources, we're talking about the ear of the learner. And I think there's a lot of struggles there. And I think the other thing that I would say is when it comes to being in the classroom, it's navigating the space the same as the key speaker this morning. Some people use allies, some people use co-conspirators. And what I say is it's the reconciliation frame. The most important part of the education experience, I'm saying, is both have to be at the table. I need to be at the table as an Indigenous person, and I need non-Indigenous people at the table as well. Because if we're going to model relationships that says I am self-determining and that I am in control of the knowledge that will be shared, those folks who are part of a system of whiteness who have owned the landscape need to be part of the conversation. Otherwise, it's just a secret society of conversation, and we're not learning new ways of working together and being together, which means it's slow and it's arduous, because the other part of being a positive experience in doing this work is the labor of having to re-educate people and to challenge thinking without getting in people's faces. And so I think it's a positive experience around developing the curriculum, because curriculum isn't the owner and isn't owned by academics. It isn't owned by the teacher. The learning space is owned by the community. It's owned by the person who's allowed to teach in that space, and it's the learner space. And we move away from this receptacle notion that we fill people up, and we move to the fact that this is a community conversation and all members of the community need to be part of it. And when that happens, it's amazing how engaged students become about learning, how amazing their mental health becomes enriched because they learn the positive elements of their experience and not, as our speaker said this morning, the victimization. And I'm telling you, this is my last comment, if I wanted to talk about the victim reality, I could do so, because I work in a space where right now I spend my days on grounds where there are not playgrounds, where we're looking for graves. And the impacts of colonization on Indigenous people and the Indian residential school system could put me in a place where I could come in from a very angry space. And the reality is if we are going to heal and build ourselves up again, self-determination is the space that we begin, that we will not allow this to happen again. So positive spaces are where we all show up and when we're all part of the conversations, and people aren't afraid. They aren't afraid to ask the ignorant question. They aren't afraid to put their foot in the mouth, because they know we're trying to change a system. And the only way we're going to get there is if we make mistakes with each other and figure it out as we go, because part of the teaching is this is my story. And if my story is I've made mistakes learning how to do it right and I've learned from it, isn't that what you would want to take away from any learning experience, is the gift of the knowledge of learning from mistake? That's it.
Thank you, Laura. So many rich points. People will be able to hear more in our afternoon breakouts. Anne, can I please hear from you, Dr. Lopez?
Hi, good morning, everyone. And let me continue with what Dr. Love started with, bringing joy into the space. And I also bring, as a descendant of the enslaved, I bring, of course, always the guiding light of my ancestors. And before I kind of respond to that question, I just quickly want to say, just thank you to the Ontario Association for Social Workers, as well as the social work group for advisory group. The title of the symposium around engage, dismantle, and change, you're actually doing it. You're engaging, you're really attempting the dismantling. And I really have to say, it takes a kind of boldness to go there. It takes a kind of boldness to you know what? I am not hiding this intentionality. We are going to say exactly what we're about. So I just want to say kudos to you. And by the way, Bettina Love unleashed me. So here I am in all of my blackness right now and in all of my joy. That was just wonderful. Now, to your question around what is the current context within Ontario in relation to decolonizing approach to education, I think I'm going to start in two places. I'm going to start with the self. So I'm going to have a little bit of comments around the self and then the institution. And so for me, and by the way, I just, it's a strange thing to have these long dreadlocks, be from Jamaica with the last name Lopez, but there were actually Spanish colonizers in Jamaica. I'd like to let people know. And of course, one day, as a descendant of the enslaved, I was talking to someone and says, what I miss most about being a descendant of the enslaved, where my ancestors were left in Jamaica, is not to know my African roots. I wish I knew where in Western Africa to go. I wish I know what language my long lost cousins are speaking. I wish I knew, but I have been to Ghana and I have seen the food. And if you go to Accra, it's like Kingston, Jamaica is a replica. But so from the individual aspect of things though, I think that the context, as you asked the question, begins with the self. We have to begin that decolonization of the mind to begin to think about decolonization. I was schooled in Jamaica up to my undergrad. No, my undergrad was not a colonizing education, some of it. My goodness gracious, we had the Trevor Monroes and we had the Brian Meeks and we had Dr. Ralph Gonzalez and others and of course, Michael Manley, who kind of told us about post-colonial work and disrupting coloniality, but I was schooled in colonial education. So before I could even begin to think about a decolonizing process, I had to begin my own undoing of my own colonial education, ways of thinking. And I will not take today to tell you how much of that I had to undo from my head to my toe. So Black joy begins with loving that self and how you show up in this earth and in this world and begin to love every aspect of who you are. I cannot tell you what a journey, at least for myself, that has been. So when we talk about in relation to the Ontario context, so you know what I'm going to say, Tracy, to that? I think in Ontario, we're kind of, as Dr. Love says, fumbling towards it. To be honest with you, I think we're in spaces now where we're trying to figure it out. You have to keep in mind, and as Dr. Love says, theory, and we all agree, gives us a frame. And I think for in Ontario, when it comes to decolonizing education, specifically now with educators in K-12 schools, they're trying to figure out convergences. They're trying to figure out, okay, so how does anti-racism theorizing inform this work? How does culturally responsive, where does decolonizing fits into this, or what extra does a decolonizing approach gives? And so, I think in some ways that's a little bit of where we are. Now, building on that, I think what is really great in those spaces, like a space today, is then beginning to think through what exactly are the remnants of colonization within education and schooling that, as Dr. Love says, we're trying to undo. And what exactly are we trying to rebuild? And so I just quickly want to focus on a few quick things in terms of that conversation. So I think in many ways, educators, both in higher ed and K-12, are coming to understand that in much of education, the centrality of Eurocentric knowledge has to be dislodged. So that's an example of the remnants of colonization. And so which voices then are centered in the space? And then we go on to talk about how do we do that when it's, not reforming or putting a little bit, but how do we tear down? And as I say, how do we disrupt and build at the same time? I think we should also not forget as well, Tracy, as you asked that question around what colonization took from us. And, Prakash and Esteva says it took from us forms of identities and our cultural institutions. So as a Black girl growing up in Jamaica, what I learned about my African ancestors were stereotypical, it was biased, it was all the knowledge was missing. So in a decolonizing process, we asked then, how is that reintroduced into the curriculum, into the space, and so on? And we'll have time to talk about a little bit more as we go on. I think it's also very important to talk about schooling practices. You know, what are the remnants of colonization? Dr. Love talked about the discipline. You know, I talk about lovingly redirecting. What does that look like? So I think within that context of the question that you've asked, I would say that's where we're at. We're trying to continue that understanding and translate that understanding into real practical actions and seeing that convergence. And I think that is happening in K-12 schools and at higher ed. I also want to give a little word of caution before I end this section, is that we must be very careful of not naming something that it's not. So we just put on the decolonizing word in front of things, but really the action is not speaking to decolonization. And quickly in my own practices, a little bit at higher ed, one of the things that I've been doing is tracing my own work and trying to put my theorizing into action. I actually started a course in my own program at OASW called Decolonizing Educational Leadership and Anti-Racist Education. And so what I'm trying to do there, one is the readings, is to have the conversations and then begin to think through collectively that co-laboring as to what might this look like in a space of leadership. If you're in a school or if you're in a higher ed, what does that practice look like? And we talked about a number of things, you know, building a relationship with community and knowledge and so on. So within my own individual context, it's a little bit of what I'm doing in this Ontario context. So you know, as I kind of close my comments here, I would say it's both at the institutional level, at the individual level, and folks are still trying to build that understanding. But building the understanding is the boldness. It is that boldness. It is that joy. It is that thinking, okay, how are we going to do discipline differently? How are we going to do the courses differently? How are we going to have the knowledge? Which stories? How are stories? And we could go on all day about, you know, we haven't even talked about research, but I'm going to stop here for now because we're waiting to hear Jillian as well.
Brilliant. Yes. No, I don't want people to feel this urgency. There is so much to speak of and so many points we want to bring forward. And we have the rest of the day and we may be able to meet again and again and again. Jillian, please give us your perspective from an Ontario context.
Wonderful. Thank you. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of your event today. Dr. Love's talk was incredible. And I'm just so honored to share the virtual stage with both Anne and Laura. So thanks so much for having me. This question is so key because institutional structures, particularly within, you know, Ontario education, and particularly those that protect colonization and whiteness are resilient. And the work of decolonization ahead really is challenging. When I think about decolonization, and I'm going to speak to it a little bit from a disability perspective, I believe that white supremacy and ableism are inextricably tied. Together, you know, they collude to perpetuate exclusion of racialized and indigenized and disabled identities. This collusion is evident in the foundations and the structures of our education system. So decolonizing education to me means challenging colonial culture, a culture that deeply shapes the experience of disabled students in schools. And so when I think about the principles of decolonization, I think and think about them in terms of, critical disability theory. There was a time, a few years back where critical disability studies took a turn to a disability justice focus. And disability justice as a framework argues that, the experiences of disabled people, particularly disabled people who face multiple sites of marginalization or oppression, are the experiences that need to be centered in discussions about how to move forward and affect change. After all, who better to understand the trappings of a system or the result of implicit or explicit forms of exclusion than people who've lived it. What I think is exciting about disability justice is that it also speaks to a cross-solidarity commitment in recognizing that there cannot be disability justice without racial justice, Indigenous justice, class justice, environmental justice, and so on, because all of these movements, all of these pushes towards justice are interconnected and are interdependent. And so I think I'll hold off. I can speak a little bit to some of the research that we're doing that speaks to this, but I'll hold off for now. But thank you.
I'd like to say welcome to you all. I'm also on fire, as Anne said. I'm sitting in this chair in Halton region on the land of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be joining in this space with you all. I have the pleasure of co-moderating with Tracy to ask a few questions, and so the next question is going to be directed to Anne. Can I ask you to address why is adopting teaching critical race theory within school boards being seen as a problem?
I'm going to give you the quick short answer first, and then I'll deconstruct it. It's the word race. It's the word race. So it's the word race, and by extension, racism. If we had said, if the theory was called critical reform theory, critical adjustment theory, critical cultural theory, nobody would have a problem with it. We'd all be doing critical cultural theory, and everybody would be sort of going around having various days celebrating critical cultures as we do right now. You know, we can go into the cafeteria and celebrate these days, but at the same time, we go back into the classrooms and students experience oppression. So I think, of course, as you know, Patricia, that number one, it's white supremacy and the institutions that support that will not give up easily. This idea that somehow everybody's going to have this big kumbaya moment and we are going to arrive with our justice needing selves, and they're going to say, girl, you just take all the justice you want. It's not going to work that way. And what we are experiencing is a system and those people who benefit from that system pushing back. So they will use anything to create fear. And of course, you and I know that critical race theory as a theory is not taught in K-12 schools, but in K-12 schools, we do teach about challenging whiteness and white supremacy. We do teach about bringing in knowledge from groups that were and people who were once excluded from the system. We do talk about challenging all the multiple and intersecting forms of oppression. So what they have done, those who are resisting and challenging and so on, is really defending and trying to keep the status quo in place. And something else I'm going to say to this, Patricia, that I don't think we pay enough attention to, and it's the role of parents and families. Some families benefit from, you know, this neoliberal individual thing. Let me go pick my own school. I want to have XYZ for just me and my child. It's the same folks who are advocating streaming, even though we know that so many students have been harmed by streaming. But yet there are people saying, oh, what's going to happen to my bright child who gets 99? Do you really mean they're going to have to sit with those students who are getting, 45? And really, so it's not just educators, it's really as a society that we have normalized certain things. And so that is why the pushback. And so critical race theory is almost kind of a name for all of the ways in which those who benefit from the status quo want to keep the status quo in place. And of course, people becoming very, as Dr. Love says, when you dehumanize someone and you position them as the other, we've all been in schools. I've been a teacher. I started teaching, it went to youth in 1992. I walked into a school in 1993. We all know how easy it was to go get that Black kid and for the slightest thing, suspend them, expel them, call the police, discredit when the family comes. We see 3 Black kids on the hill and all the teachers running around. Oh my God, there's more than 2. Let's bring the office. We all have those experiences. So what I'm trying to say here in response to your question, Patricia, as we're trying to change that, there's some folks who are resisting and really, wanting to keep the status quo. But of course, it's unjust, and we're going to seek liberation no matter what.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. I wonder if Laura, would you like to comment on that question?
I have such a struggle with the conversation. And I think it has to do very much with the fact that the delineation of us as races is the fatal flaw in the conversations. And, we come from different nations, but we're still of one race. And I think the very nature of talking about critical race theory is really pitting the conversations of us and them and putting it in the forefront of the classroom. And when we talk about us and them, it suddenly becomes, I chuckle because there's the language, and I know everybody here knows it, but I feel the need to clarify it. There's a difference between white privilege and white people, and they're distinctly different things. And I think part of the dilemma is when you start challenging white privilege, people don't know where to look anymore in the conversation, because they now have to begin to look inwards. And I think the reality is the history, and I've learned a lot of it through my work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is white burden and white guilt is palatable when somebody is doing it at their own pace, and when they can reflect on it from a context of that was the past, that's not today. And I think when we start talking about critical race theory and we start moving into those spaces of the tensions of privilege, the tensions of white privilege, the tensions of white male privilege systems, and the deep roots of systemic and structural racism, nobody wants to take it on, because the truth of the matter is it doesn't work for white privilege. And the struggle is it creates new tensions, because white privilege is something we on the margins have always aspired to, right? We want to get to, you talk about getting to the top of the ladder, having a position, having respect. The benchmarks that have been conditioned into racialized people are benchmarks that are often associated with white privilege. And I think, and I go back to our speaker, Dr. Love, this morning. I mean, the fact is, what does it mean for us? What are the definitional terms that when I go into the classroom? And I'm also, when we talk about critical race theory, I'm very conscious of fatigue, right? Because being somebody who lives in the margins, I have to use my words carefully because I don't want to offend people. I am tired of trying to find the words that don't offend people while putting my own experiences in check. And for people who are coming into these spaces who are from communities on the margin, you set yourself up as a target. And I would say the epitome of critical race theory right now is the creation of the equity and inclusion positions that are the go-to organizational response to everything that happened with George Floyd, through to murdered and missing, through to unmarked graves, is that we're going to create these positions and we're going to hire people from the community to help us see. And I think part of the problem with critical race theory is it's people, once again, and this is the fatigue quotient, it's our work to do. And everybody says you have to take it slow because we need time to adjust. And everybody says you have to find the right words because people will get defensive and angry. And I think part of the dilemma about all of this is if we enter into this conversation, if we don't find real ways to do it, I think we're going to end up with that. What I'm experiencing right now is a new kind of entrenched, deeply rooted racism that seems to be backlashing us. And I mean, I'm hearing terms that I haven't heard since the 80s, reverse racism, white racism. And I think everybody's afraid of critical race theory. And I would say in my community, a lot of the struggle is we're just learning how to use our voices again. We're just learning to navigate our own healing journeys. And then people want us to be at the front of the class leading critical race theory conversation. And it's like the only people that lose in this battle are people who are on the margins. And if I come into the conversations when I speak about my nation and yours, I try to shift the conversation that it isn't about race, it's about how we exist in the world together. And we need to find ways to get there, but I don't think we're at a space where these systems are ready. And we're at a place where we want the revolution. But I'm not completely sure that we would survive the revolution right now, because we have been so conditioned with our lateral violence and not wanting each other to be successful, that I worry that when we move into this space, that we'll be in a space of competing oppression. I mean, I do a lot of work in human rights, and the meetings I sit into where I'm still within other racialized groups referred to as the Indian woman. And you're getting resources, but we're not getting resources. We're being pitted against each other. And I don't know how we talk about critical race theory when we are fighting for scraps at the table still. And I don't have an answer. I'm just giving you the thoughts that are running through my head and saying, there's 351 people sitting in this session. I'm hoping some of you have some brilliant ideas that will take this conversation forward.
I appreciate your comments, Laura, and it's heartfelt. I totally agree with what you're saying. And now I'll turn it over to Jillian.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the pushback around examining critical race theory is that it does effectively unsettle whiteness and examine white supremacy. But I think too, when it comes to education, once you start peeling back the layers of racial justice within schools, you have to then take a very close look at the institutions that and the institutional decisions that are made within education, and how that's being upheld and how students are being organized. I have done a lot of work with the Toronto District School Board, and as Patrick Case was mentioning, it's one of the systems that collects a lot of race-based data, and it's one of the only ones in Canada that has actually put that data out into the public. And it is quite evident how our systems work to advantage white populations over racialized populations, over disabled populations. I mean, the stratification is very clear when you look at these kinds of system data. And what I found interesting is that, and I think another piece to the fear of closely looking or adopting critical race as a theory to explore schools is that when we talk about equity and justice for historically marginalized students, there's often, in groups such as this, there's often a lot of support in terms of, yes, like what can we do? What can we do to make things better? What can we do to challenge these systems that create and enact and produce oppression? But and as my colleagues and I have done in the past, when we put out information or we put out studies that challenge how whiteness is supported through these institutional decisions, I mean, the pushback is fierce, and that it's not something that I feel institutions are comfortable yet in addressing it, how there are many groups that are advantaged through these very practices that we're hoping to dismantle.
Thank you for that, Jillian.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jillian. I have another question. A wicked problem is defined as a policy and planning and is as one of those socially complex and difficult to solve intersections. New issues can be revealed even when one issue is resolved. So the wicked refers to its resistance to resolution, quite like what we're talking about. Decolonizing education, in your opinion, is it a wicked problem or is it a technical problem? Can we call on Dr. Lopez first?
Of course, course it's a wicked problem. It's in terms of you know, it's in terms of what you want to disrupt, in terms of what you want to challenge, in terms of what you change. The moment we turn the efforts, the search for justice and liberation and all of that into a technical problem, the moment we're becoming reformists, the moment we're becoming performative, it is a wicked problem. You know, injustice is wicked. You know, pain and trauma is wicked. You know, it's evil. You know, I think Dr. Love mentioned the murder of George Floyd. You have to dehumanize. You know, if that man was kneeling on a cat or a dog for 9.5 minutes, people would have jumped on him, or the people were trying, but it would never have been a conversation. But when we dehumanize, so in many ways I see it as a wicked problem in terms of the words that you've used, Tracy, as because we're challenging systems, we're challenging practices, we're challenging beliefs, we're challenging people's socialization, we're challenging you know, white privilege, we're challenging structures that didn't come into place last night. They have been in place, in space for a long time. They have been normalized. So I would say it's in terms of quote unquote, it's a wicked problem because of all that we're trying to do. And I just caution that I hope decolonizing education never becomes a technical solution or performative work.
Thank you. Laura, what are your thoughts on this idea?
I love how we find new words and new acronyms, is what I would say to you. Wicked is systemic. Wicked is structural. Wicked is white privilege. Wicked is all the things that are the roots of colonialism. And I think the reality at the end of the day is the fact that he who defines that which makes the other is always going to own the language. And I think we need new language. I think of Jillian's work, and I come from a background of disability studies and the history, how words were used to shape and form identity. Dr. Lopez, as she talks, I mean, I look and I'm trying to find the narratives of Indigenous people. I often find myself looking to the history of the broader Black community and the evolution of civil rights. And I often turn to the work of Frederick Douglass, and the same thing. You look at the words that were used to shape what makes a person whole and to make them a citizen, and then how it's reshaped and reformed. It was always done to give people hope, and then they strip hope away. So it is a wicked problem. But what it is it's the epitome of the colonial frame. He who controls the pen of Black ink controls the language of a society. And until we change the language, nothing's going to change. You need to change the soil. You need to get new roots. And it all comes back to, how do we do this when the systems we work in largely tokenize our efforts? And I don't say it from an angry place. I say it from a place of hope. I truly do believe in people's being self-determining. The struggle I always every day have is, as I try to decolonize, is the framework by which I think actually a colonized framework? Because of so many generations of what our peoples have been through, what if our thinking is truly our own thinking? And what if it has been largely shaped? Because we're having to reclaim and revitalize our own narratives. And we haven't controlled the pen, we haven't controlled Black ink. And that means our narratives are invisible. And so as we recreate them, we then get accused of rescripting history on a history that's already been rescripted. So it's systemic, it's deep, and it's structural. And I don't like the word of wicked. And I don't know why. And I think it's because where I work at my base position at Centennial College, we're using a language of wicked goals as ways of moving forward. And I think wicked is often used as an acronym to be cool, to be innovative, to be moving ahead. And the dilemma is because the language is so loaded, I don't want to be part of using language that could be twisted. Colonialism, systemic roots, and structural racism are my reality. Those are the words I will use to describe my existence.
Thank you, Laura. Jillian, do you have an opinion on this question?
Sure, but I have to apologize that a bulldozer just pulled up outside my window. So if there's some background noise, I apologize. I apologize, bad timing. Yeah, I agree. I agree with Laura too in her perception around wicked. I had a bit of a visceral reaction to that word as well. But yeah, I think in this context, decolonizing education in this definition would be considered a wicked problem where, you know, colonization is so multifaceted and deep-seated, like you peel off one layer and, you know, you expose another. And I don't think that, especially the kinds of change, like the radical changes that we're hoping to achieve within education can be reduced to technical changes. And just to give you a quick example from some research that we were doing, I know in the TDSB there was a lot of work done over the past few years in terms of de-streaming grade 9 courses across the board, and a few schools had volunteered to do some of this work ahead of you know, the province's announcements and such. And it was interesting that that shift required significant buy-in and a cultural shift at the school. And we went and spoke to you know, educators and students and administrators in schools where it was viewed as a technical shift, and we went and spoke to schools in which it was viewed as this cultural, multifaceted, ground up shift in terms of structure and equity. And as you can imagine, the outcomes for both of these, you know, these initiatives were very different. And so, yeah, I agree that I think that without that cultural work, without that cultural change, it just doesn't work. So you can have technical changes, you know, without those intrinsic ones that make the work happen.
Thank you, Jillian. I have the next question, and I'll put it in the order of speakers. I'll go to you, Jillian, first. The question is, what are the key concepts and emerging ideas that frame the current narratives around equitable and inclusive education?
Thank you for this question. I think that inclusion as a notion or as a concept applied to schools means a lot of different things. But I think inclusive education historically, like from the perspective of disability, is one that has been long studied and has shown to have, you know, many academic and social benefits for students. But I think sometimes inclusion is only understood in terms of placement. The idea that is if we could just teach students in the same space together, that the inclusion puzzle would somehow be solved. You know, and in many instances too, we hear that the goal of inclusion is sometimes conflated with this notion of assimilation, as though somehow, you know, the act of including or of being included functions as this normalizing strategy to erase disability from students' identity. And I think that what we have to be wary of as we move forward with, you know, promoting greater inclusive practice is this deficit notion that can also be prevalent within those integrated spaces. So when I think about, you know, two emerging ideas around inclusion, I think about the importance of asking ourselves, you know, what exactly are we asking students to be included into? You know, while we, you know, can change our organizational approach and include students identified as disabled or as having disabilities in mainstream classrooms, we have to ask ourselves, you know, have we actually changed the ableist pedagogies within these spaces? Have we untethered these, you know, historical notions of ability that can play a significant role in determining who is valued in our schools? Have we reconceived, you know, what we teach and how we teach to ensure we aren't perpetuating harmful disability stereotypes and misleading disability tropes. And I think the second question that's emerging is around inclusion and disability culture. And, for example, part of disability culture is working, as Laura was mentioning, with the power of language, is working towards destigmatizing and reclaiming the term disabled. If you haven't come across much on disability culture yet, you can check out the organization Sins Invalid. They have a great website, and they provide some really important examples of what disability culture is, as well as speak about disability justice. And they published some great work on that as well. But now there is a significant movement towards promoting disability culture and disability pride. So what would that look like? I think we have to ask ourselves, what would that look like in our classrooms? Can disability pride and joy, as Dr. Love was speaking to today, be cultivated when the disability community is dispersed across the school? When we think about culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, is disability or disability history or disability culture ever considered within CRRP approaches? And I'll do a really quick plug for a film, and you might have already seen it. It's called Crip Camp, and it was up for the best documentary film at this past Oscars. It's available for free on YouTube, and I assign it to all of my classes. But the film details the advent of the disability rights movement in the US, and profiles many of those who played integral roles in pushing the disability rights agenda forward. But much of those connections and relationships began when disabled youth were given the opportunity to be together, to organize, to air grievances, and to share experiences of oppression in spaces that were largely disability-led, where impairment was accepted and disability identity was celebrated. And I share that with some trepidation, because my fear is that we'll look at our current system and think, oh, well, great, we've already created spaces for disabled students to be together, and it's called special education. But the design of special education was not this. And that's not because the people working in special education classes and programs and schools aren't themselves allies of disability rights or supporters of the promotion of disability identity, but the structure of special education, even by how historically it came into being, was designed around a deficit orientation and around the logic of removing students who were perceived to pose a threat to the efficiency of public education. So I think we need to kind of keep all of these tensions in mind when we think about how we go forward and create these inclusive spaces.
Thank you so much for that, Jillian. And Anne, I'll go to you next.
Thank you, Patricia. When I think of equity and inclusion in education, if asked, I'm going to take the approach of it as is it a political project or is it not? That's going to be sort of my entry point into that. And so using that entry point, I am going to argue that schooling and education is a colonial project. Much of what we do in schooling and education, we were having the conversations in the prior question around streaming. And streaming is a colonial project. It is that whole organization of students in that way. When we talk about, I think Laura was talking about voices. Why, for example, for so long, were the voices of Black students with low resources, Indigenous students, not heard when they said, you are streaming away my potential? And so I look at that whole question within this whole sort of political project. And so if the political project of equity and inclusion is really to make people feel good, I call it laminated equity, I call it curtain equity, window dressing, we can give it whatever name we want. But if the political project of that is to make people feel good, give a little in order to prevent real systemic change, I say we have issues with this whole notion of equity and inclusion. And I think Jillian raised it well. What are we trying to assimilate students into? So, and the other side of that as well, thinking about equity and inclusion as a political project, as a project for change, then we have to begin to ask alternative questions. What about representation? What about power? What exactly, how do we define inclusion? For a long time, that word meant different things to different people. Even now, when we talk about equity, many people show up and say they are doing equity. But when you look at the practices and policies, we have questions around that. So what I'm trying to say here is that in many ways, I think of equity and inclusion as this political project, as this trying to change a system. We have to be mindful that it can be used to keep the status quo in place as a feel good, as really put the labels on. People hold power and position, but nothing changes. Or there are others who can use it to create that real change that we're seeking. Some of which is, the advocacy of parents to begin to have de-streaming in Ontario is no small feat. And really, we acknowledge advocacy of families and communities and students who argue for that, trying to get greater equity. So I think when we're in spaces, what I'm saying, and as I sort of wrap up here, when we're having this conversation, we have to ask, how is it thought about? What exactly it is that we're trying to do? What are we trying to undo? What are we trying to rebuild as we engage in these equity and inclusion initiatives?
Thank you, Anne. Laura?
My response I would start with problematizing what equity and inclusion is. It's a definition that someone else has created. I think the ability for people to be self-determining in a process or in a relationship is, and I say that because as an Indigenous person, the charter's clear. I'm not part of an equity seeking group. I'm a self-determining member of my nation. So I just want to start there. And I say that because one of the other things is education has never been about equity and inclusion, never has been. And I think the dilemma is, for anybody who's been on the margins looking in, everybody says, what's the solution? And we say, blow the system up and start again. There's a lot of truth in that. And I think, as I develop courses, and I come from a beautiful background, I come from an ancestry of survival. I have every generation of women, and for Haudenosaunee women, our line is passed down through the women. So all the women for the last 5 generations in my family are residential school survivors. That's on my mother's side. On my father's side, my mother's father, he is Ojibwe, and he is also identifies as Black because he is part of an underground railroad system that brought his family into Canada. And then he was given status on a First Nation reserve in the Dryden area so that he couldn't be taken back. I have a husband who is legally blind and identifies as a member of the disability community, lives the life of sport that is embarrassing to me because he plays hockey, he skis, he sails, he does all these things through Blind Sport Canada. And I say this to you because every time I go into conversations, I code switch constantly. I switch between my lived experience. I share his stories. I share the stories of members in our family. And when I think about inclusion and equity in the classroom, the things that always go through my head is, how do I get students into that space, the learner into that space where they can, through my stories or the teaching experience, begin to be critically reflective of their experiences in their lives and bring it in. And I think a big part of the conversation is that we have a curriculum structure, because it's so one-way driven, students don't get to be part of the conversation largely. And teachers and faculty don't know how to navigate the space of difference. They're afraid of it. They're afraid that they're going to be called a racist. They're afraid that they're going to be called a whole bunch of things. And the thing that's really important is I think we need to find ways as part of the teacher development process to move, because I remember how excited I was when UDL, like I'm old enough to remember when UDL was just a concept. I remember when the CNIB won the Stevie Wonder award for universal design because it was developed in such a beautiful way that whether you were sighted or not sighted, you could feel and live in the space based on your own provisions of barriers and those barriers being reduced. And I think we need to look at how we do cultural UDL. I use this terminology all the time in the college sector. And what I talk about is culturally focused, universally designed learning. We have in schools an increasing internationalization of the students who are part of the learning experience, and we have to find ways to engage them. So how do we? And that means teachers have to be able to be nimble in the classroom. They have to be able to engage the students' lived experience and then build it into the way they present the history and the knowledge in the courses they teach. To do that, I'm going to pull the Indigenous framework in every time, and I don't teach so much anymore. Every time I teach, I start my semester out with a circle, a sharing circle. And I ask students to talk a little bit about, and I ask the classic question that many Indigenous people ask, who are your people? It's a simple enough question. And as the students talk, I make it a game. And what I do is I walk them through it. I try to remember one fact of every student. And the reason I do it is I'm putting it to memory so that it becomes part of my teaching approach throughout the rest of the semester. And I think we need to be teaching teachers how to use these strategies. And it's not just about culture. I'm going to reach back into Jillian's space, is the fact that people need to understand disability isn't about an embodiment, it's a cultural frame for people. And that the only way other learners are going to understand that is that that person gets to claim pride of the community they're part of, and that you create that speaking and sharing circle where inclusion, equity, and self-determination are fundamental elements of the learning experience. And that's cultural UDL. And if you can do those things and embed it in courses, embed it in teacher development, and I would say to you, the professions as well, because teaching isn't just in the primary school. I think of all the social work media, social service, addictions program areas that I've been part of over the years. These elements are the things that create cultural safety, right? We can be reciprocal, we can be relational, and we can create the spaces of safety. And that's how you transform. I always chuckle with all my students all the time. World domination, one person at a time. And that's how you do it. You teach every person that they are valued and that they look at the person across from them and that person is as valued as they are. You have transformative action and transformative teaching.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'll turn you guys over now to Tracy.
Such a rich conversation. And yes, Laura, we can all learn from each other. Okay, these are just nuggets of what you'll be able to have in your afternoon sessions. I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to our panelists in helping us to understand how decolonizing and abolitionist education is manifested in our local context. And you've shared just little snippets and concepts and ideas, but it's emerging into this critical discussion that'll enable us to create more space beyond what we can occupy today. So don't go too far away because there's more to talk about. You can hear our exceptional panelists this afternoon, and we'll continue the conversation.